This week on the 77% Street Debate.
Our government is failing. For you to have electricity, you got to have big pockets for that.
We need to start focusing on new technologies and innovation, solutions from Africa for Africa.
If we think about the fact that we are living in the climate crisis, in the age of the climate crisis, what we need to be doing is transitioning away from fossil fuels.
There's one thing that keeps ringing in my head. Affordability, affordability, affordability.
The 77% is in Soweto. Now, around the world, 800 million plus people do not have access to electricity. 3/4 of those people are in Africa. So I'm joined by my panel today on this Today's Street Debate to discuss how we can bridge that gap and having everybody have access to electricity. So I'm going to start with my first panelist here. Chifumo, just lay out the scene for us, right? So this is South Africa. Just lay out the electricity supply issue in this country.
Electricity distribution in South Africa is currently monopolized by one state-owned entity called Eskom, and they have infrastructure that spans across the country. And with that infrastructure, they've went on to connect over 90% of the South African population onto the grid. Now, this is a fundamental shift from the connection or the rate of electrification prior to the dispensation of democracy in 1994, where we only had 30% of the population connected to this very humongous fleet.
Okay, so it's impressive strides in the last 25 years.
Absolutely.
But I do want to come to you, Raiz, because the electricity situation, we opened the discussion and we talked about the fact that majority of this country is electrified, right? 90%. Now, the 10% of people who don't have electricity, most of them happen to be in rural areas. Why are rural communities ostracized when it comes to electricity supply?
Now, when we're looking at these 10% unelectrified, or even the millions unelectrified in Africa, Africa is a very vast continent with a low population density in certain areas. So it doesn't make sense to build a $1 billion or rand facility to electrify 3 people who are sparsely populated.
And that tends to be the nature of the rural areas on the continent.
That's correct. So here in South Africa, the people that we're trying to reach who are not electrified, it's difficult to reach them with our existing solution, which is the utility grid, which means that we need to start focusing on new technologies and innovation, solutions from Africa for Africa. The problem with having international actors come into Africa and relying on them is they lack local insight. That's why we need our local people who understand the situation better than anyone else, we're living in it, to come forward with solutions and then bring about new ways of going about electrifying those 10% and those millions across Africa.
Okay, so let's leave that there. But I want to come over to you, Bud Rufus, because you are of the view that electricity, nobody should have to pay for that. Explain that to us.
I think, obviously right now, with the status quo as it is, right, our government is failing, right? And it's painting a picture that for you to have electricity, you got to have big pockets for that.
Just help us understand just how crippling it can be for just at an individual level, but perhaps even at a larger scale, at a macro scale, when people don't have access to electricity. We're talking about something that the United Nations has defined as a basic human right.
Okay, it affects your cooking, it affects how you bath in the morning, it affects your health, and people have died. I've buried a few neighbors. Basically, long and short, it affects your human dignity.
Okay, Lesiba, you wanted to come in?
So I wanted to touch on the health aspect that Rufus spoke about, because there are some places whereby without electricity the sanitation doesn't work. They don't have, they can't flush their toilets, they can't shower, and it affects your hygiene. It affects a lot of things. So it just goes to show that this whole issue of electricity, it overlaps into other areas that we also need to take into account. So
we happen to be in a community here in Soweto where the government doesn't supply electricity to people, but people have gone on and have made what are called illegal connections. Just explain to us what that is.
So illegal connections are ways by which people may acquire electricity that are not in line with the South African laws. So it can happen that people may steal transformers and then connect wires for themselves, and that has led to our communities being not in safe environments and also causing a lot of mortality rates.
Okay, just explain that. So how dangerous are these illegal connections?
They're extremely dangerous because there are some times whereby the cable would be laid across the road and it's exposed. And there was a community called Zandspruit whereby we had cables, live cables hanging across the actual school, whereby kids actually were there and attended classes.
Okay, so part of what you do, Lesiba, is getting into how we can electrify what you call informal areas. Just explain to us, what is your vision for electrifying these places?
Our mandate is to actually say, okay, since the government is not meeting your demands for energy or electricity, we are going to come forward with a solution, which is solar panels or electrical panels, so that you have access to certain basic needs, such as being able to cook, being able to do your homework, like for school children, and all these other things that our people are not having access to, that make life easier.
So what Lesiba is really speaking to is something that we're witnessing across the continent, and that is you have people increasingly moving to the cities, but there isn't enough housing and facilities and amenities for all of these people. So people build makeshift housing. It's certainly something that we're seeing in South Africa, but all over the continent. But this country has made a considerable investment to the tune of nearly $4 billion, right? They've invested in building 2 massive coal power plants. But you say that isn't the way to go.
Yeah, no, if we think about like the fact that we are living in the climate crisis, in the age of the climate crisis, what we need to be doing is transitioning away from fossil fuels and really scaling up on renewable energy. The 2 power plants that you just spoke about, they've put Eskom in a massive debt. They've added 200 billion rand to Eskom's debt. So they're white elephant projects, so to speak, and what we need to be doing is really scaling up on investments in renewable energy. We're slowly seeing that the financial sector is beginning to make commitments around no longer financing any coal-fired power plants. We're not at a level where we can actually say that we are moving towards a fossil-free world, but the fact that financial institutions are beginning to make these types of commitments means that in future we could possibly be investing more in renewable energy.
Okay, I do want to come to you, Gerald, because we're talking about solutions, homebred solutions. Talk to us about the kind of solutions that you are working on, right? How do we take electricity to people in the rural areas in South Africa, across the continent?
What I'm currently working on is something where we try to use renewable energy sources. So like my brother already mentioned that using solar systems. So right now in Africa or anywhere in the world, the sun is extremely abundant. And
it's really hot today.
Solar systems are becoming extremely cheap,
yeah.
right? So what we're trying to do is, can we get the solar systems to African rural areas or just rural areas in general? What I already know is that the government has tried to give solar systems to African people, but research shows that even those solar systems that were given weren't actually enough because they provide just the minimum amount of energy, which isn't really enough for people to really do anything useful with. So what I'm currently working on is trying to get, alongside with Rehi's adverts, we're trying to get cheaper distributed electricity systems into the rural areas.
Okay.
And then where I come in is I'm trying to get those systems actually connected up together. So if you have somebody with a solar system and another person with a solar system, can you get these two to actually share energy among each other? And eventually, if that can happen, you realize that if you can get more solar systems in, you can start up sort of like a mini grid in the rural areas that is completely isolated from the main power utility system. So that's what we're trying to do at the moment.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to you, Lesiba, so just stand by, but I will come to you now, Chifumo. And my question is, okay, so you believe that the renewable energy space, right, there are a lot of opportunities from a business perspective. Just talk to us about that.
Generating electricity with solar today costs you 62 cents in the South African currency. In comparison to generating electricity with other forms of technology such as coal and nuclear, which are currently sitting at above 89 cents, 92 cents. So it's cheaper. It is cheaper without any shadow of doubt. The only thing to consider is the availability factor of solar. The argument that is always projected is that solar is there during the course of the day and what happens in the evenings. Okay. Whereas with coal, you can burn coal in the evening and still have the energy that was stored within that coal. But you can't do the same with solar PV. So you need the grid to be opened up for us to do energy sharing and energy trading. So when somebody is generating from one part of Johannesburg, the other can consume in another part of KZN.
Okay. I saw, Gerald, you wanted to come in there as Chipum was talking.
We're going to have to keep training up. I think that the most important thing is that we need to learn how to train Africans, like he said, to create solutions for Africa. I think that is the only way to develop, and to speed it up is we need African minds to stay in Africa and help Africa. Because we've got a lot of African minds not being given the opportunity to do anything here. So what we do, we go overseas and we solve problems there. And then what's worse is that we try to solve African problems from there.
Yeah.
Which is to say, like Rahiz was saying, is that people out there don't understand what we're going through here, right? Somebody who develops a solution in England doesn't know what the cost of that thing needs to be for somebody on the ground, like he was saying, right? So I think that the best way to really speed it up is to encourage a culture where we support our youth, we train them up, we develop them up, we encourage them to be very creative, and most importantly, stay in Africa and help Africa. Because I think the biggest problem is we've got all our talent fleeing away. Yeah.
All right, okay, I'll come over and then I'm coming back. Raiz.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly make a point about like leapfrogging. We've already seen Africa like leapfrog in terms of like technological infrastructure. There weren't many like fixed telephone lines in Africa, but we saw Africa really come through and, you know, take up mobile telephones, you know, and mobile cell phones have been like a key way for Africans to stay connected. So like we've seen Africa already leapfrog, you know, European and North American technologies from like decades ago. So that is possible. And, you know, the financial cost doesn't have to fall on individuals, but that if we were to allow communities to collectively, you know, own their energy generation sources, we can effectively transition away from fossil fuels.
But Rufus, so you're passionate about this. You're an activist of sort for your community because of the situation that you've had with electricity supply.
Yeah.
But you've heard some of the solutions coming through from the people at the universities developing these solutions, solar PVs I'm learning about. Are you convinced about what you're hearing? And is this something that you would, for example, take into your community and convince people about?
Look, the alternatives, as the gentlemen here have been busy talking, there's one thing that keeps ringing in my head. Affordability, affordability, affordability. That is my biggest concern, right? Solars, yes. Like I mentioned, initial investment is a big concern for me. He's tried to break it down to say that maybe there's terms that you can work around and stuff like that. Being practical about it. If you walk into this household, for an example, just behind me, right? As soon as you start talking money, that becomes a bit of a concern, right? Theoretically, I see it working, right? Practically, like the other gentleman mentioned, that education, right? Education is very key, and it has to start from, like he said, from school.
Raiz, you wanted to come in here about the cost?
So I just wanted to comment on ways that you can mitigate the large upfront capital cost of a solar or alternative grid system. There's the financing option. You know, you can maybe buy it on credit or rent-to-own basis. But some guys at Wits University, they invented a new technology that allows you to start off small with a very small system and expand it over time. And that means you can buy a small module which doesn't cost a lot of money, and then as you come into more money over time, expand on your system and grow it until you reach the level of electrification you want. And that's one way that you can mitigate that upfront cost. But that is a new technology that is still going to be mass produced, and that is the future of electrification.
Okay. One of the things that Rufus talked about, Ahmed, is affordability. But help us understand the urgency of this, right? It's not a nice to have. Do we want solar or do we want to use fossil fuels? Help us understand as we close this discussion, taking into account everything you've heard.
I think the arguments have already been made because the costs of renewable energy has plummeted in recent years. It's a no-brainer honestly, for governments to actually scale up on renewable energy investments and really not go for fossil fuel based energy generation. And I think the sort of reason why governments really push for fossil based energy is because there are vested interests involved. In South Africa, we're still heavily subsidizing the coal sector, as well as also we've seen the levels of corruption in the sector in the last decade or so. And so we are artificially limiting renewable energy because of those policies that allow for coal, oil, and gas to thrive in the country. The point I'm trying to make here is that our economies are going to be decimated if we don't act sooner.
Okay, so with those words, act sooner. This is where we end today's street debate. But of course, this discussion doesn't end here. We're so interested to know what you think about what you've heard today and perhaps how it applies to the country that you're in. This is the street debate in Soweto. It's been good having your company. Bye-bye.